I watched a 7-foot creature stand in front of a shattered mirror, struggling to button a flannel shirt with claws that were never meant for such delicate work. What I discovered about its reason for trying will haunt me forever. My name is Marcus Holt, and I'm 71 years old. For nearly 50 years, I've carried a secret that defies everything we think we know about the world. In the winter of 1975, deep in the forests of northern Minnesota, I encountered something that shouldn't exist. But what made this encounter different from any campfire story you've heard wasn't just that I saw it, it's that I understood it, and that understanding changed the entire trajectory of my life. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and hit that like button. I need to know I'm not the only one who's going to lose sleep over this story tonight. And subscribe, because trust me, you'll want to hear what else I've kept hidden all these years. January 1975. I was 23 years old, working as a field surveyor for the Forestry Service. My job was simple but solitary. I'd spend weeks at a time in remote sections of the Superior National Forest, mapping terrain, marking timber boundaries, and documenting wildlife patterns. It was lonely work, but I preferred it that way. After 2 years in Vietnam, I wasn't ready to be around people much. The forest felt safer than any city street. The winter that year was brutal. Temperatures regularly dropped to -20, and snow accumulated in drifts that reached above my waist in places. Most surveyors had packed up by mid-December, but I volunteered to stay on through February. The pay was better, and honestly, I had nowhere else to be. No family waiting, no girlfriend, no apartment lease. Just me, my equipment, and about 40 square miles of frozen wilderness. I'd set up a base camp in an abandoned ranger station about 15 miles from the nearest road. The structure was old, built sometime in the 1940s, but it was solid. Stone foundation, thick log walls, a fireplace that still worked. Someone had left behind a few pieces of furniture, a wooden chair, a cot with a thin mattress, and oddly, a full-length mirror propped against one wall. The mirror was cracked down the middle, splitting any reflection into 2 distorted halves, but it was the only one for miles, so it stayed. My routine was predictable. I'd wake before dawn, eat a cold breakfast because I needed to conserve firewood, then head out into the forest with my surveying equipment. I'd work until the light started failing, usually around 4 in the afternoon that time of year, then return to the station. By 6, I'd have a fire going and would spend the evening updating my maps, writing reports, and trying not to think too much about the war. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I preferred it. But there were moments, usually late at night when the fire burned low and the wind howled through the trees, when I'd feel something I couldn't quite name. Not loneliness, exactly. More like awareness. The sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought, that something was watching from just beyond the firelight. I'd heard the stories, of course, every surveyor, logger, and ranger in northern Minnesota had. Tales of massive wolf-like creatures that walked upright. Things that howled in voices that sounded almost human. Tracks in the snow that measured 18 inches long with claws that gouged the frozen earth. The old-timers called them different names: Wendigo, skinwalkers, wolfmen. The younger guys just called them bullshit. I fell somewhere in between. I didn't believe in monsters, but I'd seen enough in Vietnam to know that the world contained things that didn't fit neatly into rational categories. So when I heard strange sounds at night, deep howls that seemed to come from something with a throat larger than any wolf, I logged them in my reports as unidentified wildlife vocalizations and tried not to think about them too much. But on January 19, 1975, something changed. I'd spent the day surveying a section of forest about 3 miles north of the station. The work had been slow. My equipment kept freezing, and I'd had to stop every 20 minutes to warm my hands. By the time I started back, it was already getting dark, and the temperature was dropping fast, -15 and falling. I was about a mile from the station when I noticed the tracks. They were fresh, probably made within the last hour. Large, much larger than any wolf. The stride was wrong too long, too deliberate. And the pattern. It wasn't the four-legged gait of a normal animal. These tracks showed 2 feet, 2 massive feet, each step separated by nearly 4 feet of distance. Something was walking upright through my forest. I followed the tracks with my flashlight, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. They led in a meandering path through the trees, occasionally stopping at places where something had been examined or disturbed. A fallen log that had been overturned, a tree where bark had been stripped away, a deer carcass mostly eaten, but in a way that suggested hands, not just teeth, had been used to tear it apart. The tracks were heading toward my station. I should have been terrified. Part of me was. But another part, the part that had survived 2 years in a jungle where death could come from any direction at any moment, that part just went cold and focused. I checked my rifle, made sure a round was chambered, and continued following the tracks. They led right to my door. But they didn't stop there. They circled the station slowly, deliberately. Whatever made them had been studying the structure. The tracks showed where it had stopped at each window, pressing close enough to peer inside. Where it had examined the door, perhaps testing whether it was locked. Where it had stood near the chimney, maybe drawn by the smell of smoke or the promise of warmth. Then the tracks led away, back into the forest, heading northwest toward a dense section of pine trees about a quarter-mile distant. I stood outside my station in the gathering darkness, rifle in hand, and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I decided to follow. The logical thing would have been to go inside, lock the door, keep the fire burning all night, and wait until morning to radio for backup. That's what any sane person would have done. But I wasn't thinking logically. I was thinking like a soldier who needed to understand the threat, who needed to know what was out there, where it lived, and whether it would come back. So I followed the tracks into the darkening forest. The snow was deep enough that I could move quietly, each step muffled by the soft powder. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tracks as they led deeper into the pines. The temperature continued dropping, and my breath came in short, controlled bursts. I kept my rifle ready, safety off, finger resting alongside the trigger guard. After about 10 minutes, I noticed something strange. The tracks were getting more erratic. They'd been purposeful before, moving in a straight line. But now they wandered, circling trees, backtracking, moving in patterns that suggested confusion or distress. At one point, the creature had fallen. I could see where its body had impacted the snow and where it had struggled to stand again, using its hands, not paws, hands, to push itself upright. Something was wrong with it. I moved more cautiously now, aware that a wounded or sick animal was far more dangerous than a healthy one. The tracks led to a small clearing, and that's where I saw the structure. It wasn't natural. Someone or something had built a shelter using fallen branches, pine boughs, and what looked like pieces of old tarp, maybe scavenged from abandoned campsites. The construction was crude but effective, creating a lean-to that would provide basic protection from wind and snow. The tracks led directly inside. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, listening. The forest was silent, except for the distant whisper of wind through the pines. No growling, no movement, nothing that suggested immediate danger. But something was in that shelter. I could feel it. I should have left, should have marked the location and come back with rangers, with backup, with people who had more firepower and better judgment than a traumatized veteran with a death wish. But I didn't leave. Instead, I walked toward the shelter, my flashlight beam sweeping across the opening. What I saw inside made me freeze completely. It was lying on its side, curled into a fetal position, shivering violently despite being covered with what looked like multiple layers of stolen clothing. Jackets, blankets, even what appeared to be a sleeping bag, all piled on top of a body that was too large, too wrong, to be human. I could see its face partially in the flashlight beam, elongated snout, like a wolf, but with a more pronounced brow and eyes that were set forward, predator's eyes that could judge distance and track movement. Its ears were pointed, set high on its head, twitching slightly despite the creature's obvious weakness, and its body, covered in thick, dark fur that seemed to absorb the light, was massive. Even curled up and shivering, it had to be at least 7 feet long. It was dying. I could tell from the labored breathing, the violent shivers, the way its eyes, when they briefly opened, seemed unfocused and glazed. This thing, whatever it was, had maybe hours left. I lowered my rifle slowly. I don't know why. Military training said eliminate the threat. Survival instinct said run. But something else, something I couldn't name, made me lower my weapon and step closer. The creature's eyes focused on me. For just a moment they cleared, and I saw something in them that made my breath catch. Not animal awareness, but understanding, recognition, fear. It was afraid of me. I knelt down slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. The creature watched me but didn't try to attack, didn't even growl. It just watched with those intelligent, terrified eyes. I could see the problem now. Its left foreleg, or arm, I wasn't sure what to call it, was badly injured. The fur was matted with frozen blood, and I could see what looked like an old steel trap still partially embedded in the flesh. The kind trappers used to use decades ago before they were outlawed. The wound was infected severely. Even in the cold, I could smell the rot. This thing had been suffering for days, maybe weeks. It had been trying to survive, trying to stay warm, trying to tend to a wound it couldn't properly reach or treat. And it was losing that fight. I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. I went back to the station. It took me 40 minutes to gather what I needed. My medical kit from my surveyor's pack, extra blankets, a camp stove, water, and the bottle of whiskey I kept for especially cold nights. I also brought a hacksaw, pliers, and wire cutters. If I was going to do this, I needed to remove that trap. When I returned to the shelter, the creature was still there, still shivering, but its eyes tracked me as I approached. It watched as I set down my supplies and began heating water on the camp stove. It watched as I laid out my medical supplies and tools, and when I moved closer with the wire cutters, it understood what I was about to do. It didn't fight me. Over the next 3 hours, working by flashlight and fire, I removed the trap from its leg. The steel had embedded deep, crushing bone and tearing through muscle. The creature made sounds during the process, low whines and growls that sounded disturbingly close to human crying, but it never tried to bite me or push me away. It just endured. I cleaned the wound as best I could with the hot water and whiskey. The creature tensed when the alcohol hit the exposed tissue, letting out a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. But again, it didn't attack. I applied antibiotic ointment from my kit, wrapped the leg in clean bandages, and covered the creature with every blanket I'd brought. Then I sat back exhausted and looked at what I'd just done. I just provided medical treatment to something that shouldn't exist, something that every scientific authority would say was impossible. And I'd done it because when I looked into its eyes, I hadn't seen a monster. I'd seen a person. The creature looked back at me, and very slowly, very deliberately, it made a sound. Not a growl or a howl, but something softer, something that, if I didn't know better, I would have called grateful. I stayed with it that night. The temperature dropped to -23, and I kept the fire going, feeding it branches and pine needles, making sure the creature stayed warm. Around midnight, its shivering finally stopped. Around 2 in the morning, its breathing evened out. By dawn, it was sleeping peacefully, its massive chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. I returned to the station as the sun came up, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What was I going to do? I couldn't just leave it out there. The injury needed continued treatment, monitoring for infection, regular bandage changes. but I also couldn't tell anyone. If I reported this, federal agents would descend on this forest. The creature would be captured, studied, probably killed in the name of science. I'd seen enough death in Vietnam. I wasn't going to be responsible for more. So I made a choice that morning that would define the next 5 decades of my life. I decided to help it survive, no matter what it cost me. And I decided to keep its existence secret, even if that meant lying to my employers, my colleagues, and eventually everyone I'd ever meet. For the next 2 weeks, I visited the shelter twice a day. I brought food, canned meat, dried fish, anything high in protein. I brought more blankets and tarps to reinforce the shelter. I changed the bandages and monitored the wounds healing. The creature accepted all of this with what seemed like cautious gratitude. It never tried to hurt me, never showed aggression. Instead, it watched me work with those intelligent eyes, and slowly, carefully, we began to communicate. Not with words. Its vocal anatomy couldn't produce human speech, though it could make an impressive range of sounds, but with gestures, with expressions, with a vocabulary of nods and head shakes and pointing that we developed together. Within days, I could ask simple questions and receive simple answers. Are you in pain? Yes. Are you hungry? Yes. Do you trust me? A longer pause, then a slow, deliberate nod. By the end of the second week, the infection was clearing. The creature could put weight on the injured leg again. And one morning, when I arrived with supplies, I found it had left the shelter and was sitting outside in the snow, its face turned toward the weak winter sun. It was recovering, and once it recovered, I knew it would leave. Return to whatever wilderness it had come from, disappear back into legend and rumor, I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt something unexpected, loss. In 2 weeks of caring for this creature, I'd formed a connection I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't a pet. It wasn't even really an animal. It was something else, something in between, and I wasn't ready to say goodbye. But 3 days later, something happened that changed everything. Something that revealed a truth I never could have imagined. Something that made me understand this creature wasn't just intelligent. It was desperate to be something it could never be. I arrived at the shelter just after dawn to find it empty. The creature was gone, and for a moment I felt that loss crystallize into certainty. It had healed enough to leave, and it had done so without even a goodbye. I stood in the empty shelter, surrounded by the blankets I'd brought, and realized I was mourning the departure of something the world said didn't exist. Then I heard sounds coming from the direction of my station. Strange sounds. The clatter of objects being moved, the creak of old wood. Something was in my camp. I ran back, rifle in hand, my mind jumping to worst-case scenarios. Bears occasionally broke into ranger stations searching for food. Had one found my supplies while I was gone? But as I approached, I realized the sounds were too careful, too deliberate. This wasn't an animal ransacking a space. This was someone or something moving objects with purpose. I pushed open the door slowly, rifle raised. The creature stood in the center of my station, frozen in place, staring at me with an expression I can only describe as guilty, like a child caught doing something it knew was wrong. But what made me lower my rifle in complete shock wasn't just that it was there. It was what it was doing, what it was wearing. The creature had found my spare clothes, an old flannel shirt I'd left hanging on a hook, a pair of canvas work pants, and it was trying, with great difficulty and obvious frustration, to put them on. The pants hung comically short on its legs, the flannel shirt strained across its broad chest, and its claws made buttoning the shirt almost impossible. But it was trying, desperately, intently trying. And it was doing all of this while standing in front of the broken mirror I'd left propped against the wall. The creature was trying to dress itself, and it was using the mirror to see how it looked. I stood there in the doorway, rifle hanging forgotten in my hands, trying to process what I was seeing. The creature turned toward me, and in its eyes, I saw something that broke my heart. Shame. Deep, overwhelming shame at being caught trying to be something it wasn't. something it could never be, human. That was the moment I truly understood. This creature didn't just possess intelligence, it possessed self-awareness. It knew what it was, and it desperately wished to be something else. We stood there, facing each other across that small room. Me with my rifle lowered, the creature wearing my clothes standing in front of that shattered mirror, its reflection split into two distorted halves. Neither of us moved for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the creature did something that changed everything. It looked down at the shirt it was wearing, at the buttons it had managed to fasten incorrectly, leaving the whole thing crooked and gaping. It made a sound, low and mournful, and began trying to remove the clothes. Its movements were frantic now, almost panicked, as if it needed to shed this pretense immediately, as if being caught trying to be human was the ultimate humiliation. I set down my rifle and moved forward slowly. The creature froze, watching me with wary eyes. I reached out, not threateningly, and gently stopped its hands, or paws, or whatever they were. 5-fingered appendages with thick pads and retractable claws, somewhere between human hands and wolf paws. I stopped them from tearing off the shirt. Then I did something that must have looked insane. I helped it button the shirt correctly. My fingers worked the buttons through the holes while the creature stood perfectly still, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Confusion, maybe. Wonder, disbelief that I was helping rather than mocking or fleeing. When I finished, I stepped back and gestured toward the mirror. The creature turned slowly, looking at its reflection. The shirt fit terribly. The pants were absurdly short. The whole effect would have been comical if it wasn't so deeply, profoundly sad. But the creature looked at itself with something I can only describe as longing. It touched the fabric of the shirt gently, carefully, as if it were something precious. Then it looked at me, and in its eyes, I saw a question. Why are you helping me do this? Why aren't you afraid? I didn't have a good answer. Maybe because I'd spent 2 years in Vietnam seeing how thin the line between human and monster really was. Maybe because those 2 weeks of caring for it had created a bond I couldn't ignore. Or maybe because when I looked at this creature standing in front of a broken mirror, desperate to see itself as something other than what it was, I saw myself. I pulled out the chair I'd been using and sat down. Then I gestured for the creature to sit too. It looked at the cot, then at me, then carefully, awkwardly, lowered itself onto the thin mattress. The frame groaned under its weight but held. We sat there in the weak morning light, filtering through the grimy windows, and I began to talk. I don't know if it understood my words, probably not, but I think it understood my tone, my intent. I told it about Vietnam, about watching boys, barely 18, try to act like soldiers when they were terrified children, about seeing humans do things that were monstrous, about coming home to a country that saw me as something other than human, something dangerous and broken. I told it I understood wanting to be something you're not, wanting to fit into a world that has no place for you, wanting to look in a mirror and see someone different than what you are. The creature listened. Its eyes never left my face, and occasionally it would make soft sounds, not interrupting, just acknowledging. When I finished, silence filled the station. Then the creature did something extraordinary. It raised one massive hand and placed it gently on my shoulder, not aggressively, comfortingly. The gesture was unmistakably human in its intent. We were both alone, both trying to survive in a world that didn't want us, both looking for a connection we'd never expected to find. Over the following days, I made a decision that I knew was insane, but felt necessary. I began teaching it. Not complex things, just simple human behaviors, gestures, and ways of existing in the space we shared. I showed it how to use simple tools, how to open cans without destroying them, how to sit in a chair properly, how to use a blanket as covering rather than just piling them on randomly. And the creature learned with shocking speed. Within a week, it could open my canned food supplies, not for itself, but to help me prepare meals. It learned to tend the fire, adding wood at appropriate intervals, banking the coals at night. It learned to help me organize my surveying equipment, sorting tools by size and type. But what fascinated it most was that mirror. Every morning it would stand in front of the cracked glass, studying its reflection. Sometimes it would try on different pieces of clothing I'd leave out. A hat that perched ridiculously on its head, gloves that couldn't accommodate its claws, a scarf it learned to wrap around its neck. None of it fit properly. All of it looked absurd. But the creature would study itself anyway, and in its eyes I could see that same desperate longing, the wish to be something it could never be. One morning, about 3 weeks after I'd found it in my station, I woke to find the creature sitting in front of the mirror, making sounds I'd never heard before. They were almost like words, attempts at human speech using vocal cords that weren't designed for it. The sounds were mangled, barely recognizable, but I could make out what it was trying to say. Marcus. My name. It was trying to say my name. I sat up slowly, watching as the creature pointed at me, then at itself in the mirror, then tried again. Marcus. I moved closer and knelt beside it. Up close I could see its throat working, could see the strain of trying to form sounds its anatomy wasn't built for. I placed my hand gently on its chest, shaking my head. It didn't need to hurt itself, trying to speak. We'd been communicating just fine without words, but the creature looked at me with such intensity, such desperate need to bridge that gap, that I felt something inside me break. This wasn't just about mimicry. This was about belonging, about being recognized as something more than a monster in the woods, about being seen as a person. I don't know what made me do what I did next. Maybe temporary insanity, maybe compassion, maybe just the bone-deep loneliness of two beings who'd found each other in the middle of nowhere. But I reached out and took the creature's hand, or paw, whatever it was, and I said clearly, so it could see my mouth form the words, "You're not alone anymore. Neither of us is." The creature made a sound, not a growl or a howl, something softer, more broken. Its eyes filled with what I swear were tears, though I didn't know if its species could cry. It squeezed my hand gently, careful of its strength, and in that moment we had an understanding. I would protect its secret. I would help it survive. And in return, it would stay, at least for a while, because we'd both found something in that isolated station that neither of us had expected. Family. But 3 days later, reality came crashing back in a way I should have anticipated but didn't. My supervisor radioed to inform me that a team would be visiting my station within the week. Routine check-in, he said. Making sure the winter isolation hadn't driven me crazy, making sure I was maintaining proper records. I looked at the creature, which was at that moment wearing a flannel shirt and sitting by the fire like some kind of surreal nightmare image, and I realized what I had to do. It couldn't be here when they arrived. We'd been lucky. We'd had almost a month of isolation, but that was ending. The creature had to leave, had to return to the forest, had to go back to being invisible. I spent that evening trying to explain it using our limited communication system. I drew pictures of trucks and people. I showed it my calendar pointing at the approaching date. I made gestures indicating it needed to leave, to hide, to stay away from the station for at least a week. The creature understood. I could see it in its eyes, the immediate comprehension followed by something that looked like resignation. Of course, this couldn't last. Of course, the outside world would intrude. Of course, this brief moment of connection would end. It had probably known all along that this was temporary. Only I had been foolish enough to think otherwise. That night, the creature gathered the clothes it had been wearing, the flannel shirt, the 2 short pants, even the ridiculous hat. It folded them carefully and set them on the cot. Then it stood in front of the mirror one last time, studying its reflection. Without the clothes, without the pretense, it was just what it had always been. A creature of the forest, powerful and strange, existing in the space between animal and something else. It looked at me, and very deliberately, it placed its hand over its heart. Then it pointed at me, our gesture for connection, for understanding, for the friendship we'd built. I repeated the gesture back. Then the creature turned and walked out into the darkness, disappearing into the forest without looking back. I stood in the doorway of that station, watching the darkness swallow it, and felt a loss so profound I could barely breathe. My supervisor and his team arrived 4 days later. They checked my records, inspected the station, asked how I was managing the isolation. I told them I was fine, showed them my maps, my surveys, my reports. Everything was in order, everything was professional. They had no reason to suspect that anything unusual had happened. But after they left, I went back to that shelter in the forest, the crude lean-to where I'd first found the dying creature. It was empty except for the blankets I'd left behind, neatly folded, and on top of the blankets, carefully placed, was a single object, a piece of broken mirror about 6 inches long, a fragment of the shattered glass from my station. The creature had taken a piece of that mirror with it when it left, a reminder of those weeks when it had tried to be something other than what it was, or maybe a promise that it would remember the human who had helped it dress itself in front of a broken reflection. I picked up the mirror fragment and carried it back to the station. And I made a decision that would define the next 50 years of my life. I would stay here. I would maintain this post as long as possible. And I would watch over these woods, protecting the secret of what lived in them, protecting a creature that had shown me more humanity than most humans I'd known. Because that's what you do for family. Even when that family walks on 4 legs and has fur and fangs and can't speak your language, you protect them, you keep their secrets, and you never ever reveal what you know to a world that would destroy them. I maintained that post for 3 more years, through 1976, 1977, and into early 1978, I remained stationed in the Superior National Forest, officially as a senior surveyor, unofficially as a guardian of something the world didn't know existed. The Forestry Service was happy to keep someone willing to work the remote stations year-round. They didn't question why I never requested transfers or took extended leave. They just appreciated having one less position to fill. During those 3 years, I had 11 more encounters with the creature, not frequent, but regular enough that I came to understand these meetings weren't accidental. It was checking on me, just as I was watching over it. The creature never came back to the station, not while I was there, but I would find signs of its presence, tracks near my camp that appeared overnight, small gifts left at the forest shelter, a large deer carcass placed where I would find it on my survey routes, providing meat I couldn't otherwise obtain. Once a dead wolf positioned near a trail I frequently used. The wolf had been stalking me for days. I'd noticed it but hadn't considered it a serious threat. The creature had eliminated the problem for me. We developed a routine over those years. Once a month, weather permitting, I would hike to a specific location, a small clearing about 2 miles from the station, marked by a distinctive split pine tree that had been struck by lightning years ago. I'd bring supplies, extra clothes that might fit better than my original offerings, better blankets as I could afford them, canned food, medical supplies, things the creature couldn't obtain on its own. I'd leave them there and retreat. The next day the supplies would be gone, and in their place I'd find something the creature had left, usually practical items, bundles of medicinal plants I could use for minor ailments, once an entire deer hide, perfectly preserved, better than anything I could have done. Sometimes just arrangements of stones or sticks, patterns that seemed to carry meaning I couldn't quite decipher, but that felt like communication nonetheless. And twice during those 3 years, I saw it clearly. Not glimpses or shadows, but full sightings where we stood facing each other across distance, acknowledging each other's presence. Both times the creature was wearing pieces of clothing. The flannel shirt I'd helped it button that first morning, a jacket I'd left at the drop site, It was maintaining that connection to humanity even in its isolation, even when there was no practical reason to wear human clothes in the wilderness. The second time I saw it clearly was in November 1977, just before the first major snowfall. I was surveying a remote section when I noticed it standing about 50 yards away, partially obscured by pine trees. We looked at each other for several minutes, neither approaching, neither retreating. Then the creature raised one hand in a gesture I'd taught it during our time together, a simple wave. Hello. Acknowledgement. Recognition. I waved back, and the creature turned and melted into the forest. That was the last time I saw it clearly. But I knew it was still there, still watching, still surviving in the spaces between the world humans inhabited and the true wilderness beyond. In March 1978, I received a notice that my position was being reassigned. Budget cuts meant they were consolidating remote posts, and my station would be permanently closed by summer. I'd be transferred to a position closer to civilization, working out of the main forestry office in Duluth. It was a promotion technically, better pay, better accommodations, normal human interaction. Everything a reasonable person would want. But I requested a meeting with my supervisor and tried to convince him to let me stay. I failed. By June 1978, I was packing up the station, preparing to leave the forest I'd called home for nearly 4 years. The last night before my transfer, I hiked to our meeting spot one final time. I brought the best supplies I could manage on my limited budget. High-quality winter gear, several wool blankets, a real camping stove, matches sealed in waterproof containers, canned food that would last for years. And I brought a letter. I'd written it carefully over several nights, explaining in words the creature couldn't read why I was leaving, where I was going, and why I couldn't stay. I knew it couldn't understand the written words, but I left it anyway, sealed in a waterproof bag. Maybe someone would find it someday, maybe no one would, but I needed to write it, needed to explain myself, even if only to the empty forest. I spent 3 hours at that clearing, sitting against the split pine tree, waiting, hoping for one more sighting, one more moment of connection before I left for good. The creature never appeared. But as the sun set and I prepared to leave, I heard a sound in the distance, a howl deep and resonant and unmistakably directed toward me, not threatening, almost mournful. A goodbye. I howled back. It probably sounded ridiculous, a human trying to mimic that sound. But I howled into the darkening forest, and somewhere in the distance the creature responded one more time. Then silence. I walked back to the station, collected my few belongings, and left the next morning. The door remained unlocked. I couldn't bring myself to lock it. Maybe the creature would use it for shelter when winter came. Maybe it would just remain empty and forgotten. Another abandoned structure slowly reclaimed by the forest. Either way, I couldn't lock that door. It felt like closing a chapter I wasn't ready to finish. My life moved on, as lives do. I worked in Duluth for 2 years, hated every minute of it, then left the Forestry Service entirely. I drifted for a while, taking odd jobs, never staying anywhere long. In 1983, I settled in northern Wisconsin, bought a small property near the Nicolet National Forest, and started working as a freelance carpenter. It was solitary work that let me stay near the wilderness. I never married, never had children, never formed connections that lasted. People assumed I was just another damaged veteran who couldn't adjust to normal life. They weren't entirely wrong. But every few months, I'd pack a bag and drive back to Minnesota. I'd hike into the Superior National Forest, back to that clearing with the split pine tree, and I'd leave supplies. For 37 years, from 1978 until 2015, I made that pilgrimage. Sometimes the supplies would be untouched when I returned months later. Those times hollowed me out, made me wonder if the creature had died, if I was leaving offerings for a ghost. But other times, the supplies would be gone, replaced with small signs of life. Tracks in the snow, arrangements of stones. Once in 1989, a child's jacket, carefully folded, placed where I'd left adult-sized clothes. That discovery made me realize something I hadn't considered. The creature might have found others of its kind, might have had offspring, might have built a family in the wilderness while I remained alone. I kept that child's jacket. I still have it, actually, stored in a box with a fragment of mirror the creature left me in 1975. They're the only physical evidence I have of those months we spent together. Everything else exists only in memory and in journals I've kept hidden for 5 decades. In 2015, I made my last trip to that clearing. I was 63 years old, dealing with health issues that made the hike increasingly difficult, and facing the reality that I couldn't keep doing this forever. I left the best supplies I could afford, and I left another letter, this one explaining that I was getting old, that my visits might become less frequent, eventually stopping altogether, that I hoped the creature, or its descendants, had found safety and family in the deep forest, that I would remember our time together until my last breath. I sat at that clearing for hours, just like I had 40 years earlier, and, just like 40 years earlier, the creature never appeared. But as I prepared to leave, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Carved into the split pine tree, about 7 feet up, where I'd never thought to look, were marks. Deep gouges in the bark, made by something with claws. The marks formed a pattern, rough, primitive, but unmistakable. 2 figures, one large and one small, standing side by side. Next to them, a crude heart shape. The creature had left me a message, maybe years ago, maybe recently. A message carved into a tree where it knew I'd eventually see it. We were family. We'd remember each other. The connection we'd formed in that isolated station in front of a broken mirror wasn't forgotten. I traced those carvings with my fingers and realized I was crying. 63 years old, standing alone in a forest, crying over marks in a tree left by something the world said didn't exist. But it did exist. It existed, and it remembered me. And that mattered more than anything science or logic or rational thought could explain. I haven't been back since. My health won't allow it anymore. But I think about that creature every day. About the morning I found it trying to dress itself in front of a shattered mirror. About the desperate need I saw in its eyes to be something other than what it was. About the strange, impossible friendship we formed in the space between human and wild. If this story made you think differently about what might be out there in the forests, hit that subscribe button. Because I've got 4 more decades of secrets to share, and you won't want to miss what comes next.